I'd first of all like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay respects to elders past and present. Now, there are just so many things that are really horribly wrong about our current policy of detention, of mandatory detention, indefinite detention, and of course offshore detention. And these range from breaches of international laws, the deprivation of individual human rights, astronomically high costs, and the strain on relationship with our near neighbours, such as in Asia. But the area that I'll be concentrating on is the lack of healthcare, and more specifically, the lack of healthcare in the offshore detention centres, despite the government's reassurances. Now, I'm just going to very briefly cover the people that we're talking about, because I think most people here would be familiar with the scenario. If we consider refugees to be broadly in two categories, the refugees who are selected from offshore and those who arrive onshore. Now, offshore is generally the resettlement from those UNHCR camps, and a significant amount of the world's 65 million displaced people are located in these camps. Now, in fact, only the USA, Canada and Australia take meaningful numbers of this, and the standard provided to these individuals is entirely appropriate. Typically, they get access to the different services and income support, housing, and all the rights depending on their specific situation. These are the group that the Australian politicians describe as when Australia is more than generous to people coming seeking asylum. But the problem arises with those who are not part of this resettlement program and those who try to gain asylum through crossing the border and into a safe country. In Australia's case, it's by boat, but otherwise it can also be in the back of a truck or part of those long queues when people make those treks by foot. But the thing is, this happens all over the world. With Pakistan, Turkey and Lebanon, bear overwhelmingly the brunt of this. 85% of those fleeing persecution arrive and stay in developing countries. So going back to the UN Convention, if we remember under the UN Convention, seeking asylum by any means possible is allowed. And the background to this was the very tragic event immediately prior to World War II outbreak, where over 900 refugees who were fleeing Europe were turned away by successive countries, including by Australia and Canada. But despite being one of the very first signatories to this convention, the Australian governments routinely ignore this. Since the 1990s, Australia has been imprisoning in detention centres those people who do make it to the country by boat. And some of these detention centres were located in quite remote desert conditions, more than a day's drive from anywhere. Now, this was strategic, as the detention centres that have been located in the outskirts of major cities, such as Villawood, had attracted frequent protesters from the community. Also, media occasionally made their way inside the detention centres, posing as visitors, and of course human rights lawyers had this annoying habit of popping up too. But now these remote centres were completely isolated and in the searing heat. And just as a by-the-by, if you Google Woomera online, some of the most harrowing videos you can see will turn up. These are videos that have been secretly recorded. Now, in late 2001, eventually Australia made deals with impoverished Pacific Islands to house the refugees there. This policy came and went with the successive government changes, but has been consistently in place since July 2013, when the new Labor Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, declared that no one who arrived by boat or was settled on these two islands of Nauru and Manus would ever be resettled in Australia. Now, currently, as we can see, the clear majority of individuals who have been imprisoned there, so around 80%, have been found to have valid refugee claims under Australia's own refugee assessment procedures. But if they arrived after July 19, 2013, Australia refuses to accept them. Until very recently, journalists have been banned from these centres, and in the case of Nauru, from the whole island. So I've put together 10 of the worst aspects of the centres, and believe me, that's quite hard, because every day there are more and more transgressions. The first one, when we're talking about healthcare, would be the deaths. Now, these have occurred from a range of causes, with suicide, physical attacks and heart conditions just being some of them. Now, I'm not going to go through all 14 of them. I haven't got pictures for 3 or 4 of them, but a couple of particular ones Reza Barati, who's the man in the top left corner, was attacked by up to 15 men, including detention centre security guards, on a night in February 2014 that has come to be known as the riots. But in fact, it wasn't a riot. The locals, police and others outside the centre who were fed up with refugees being housed on their island burst through the fencing and started attacking. Now, this was interesting because at that stage the Immigration Minister was Scott Morrison, and Scott Morrison said that Reza Barati's body had been found outside the compound, whereas that in fact was not the case. And the official report states, and I'm going to read this, Reza was dragged out from where he had been hiding under a bed and was attacked with a wooden pole spiked with nails. Then, while still prone and bleeding, he had a rock dropped on his head and he died of his head injuries. The second man across there, Hamid Karzai, died when his cut foot became septic and the Immigration Department delayed his transfer off the island until he was brain dead from septicemia, but I'll talk more about him later. And the third man, Faisal, died in December 2016 after he had reportedly presented to the Australian-run medical clinic, IHMS, some 20 to 30 times and was told that he was faking it. He was having seizures and fainting attacks until he finally died. Number two, children are affected. The children have regressed developmentally in the time they've been there, with children as young as 6 and 8 years old displaying self-harm and suicidal tendencies, something that child psychiatrists around the world all agree is very rare in pre-adolescence. And we've also seen the emergence of something called resignation syndrome. You may have heard about this in the media recently, where children give up. They stop eating, they stop drinking, they stop communicating, they're unable to go to the toilet, and eventually they even lose their reflexes. A Canadian Amnesty International official recently noted that when he visited Nauru and he asked a little crying girl for her name, she replied with a 6-digit number. Some young children who were born there no longer remember their own given name. The sleeping tents are also quite far from the toilet blocks, and many women and children fear going to the toilet at night as they've been sexually propositioned and molested by the security guards. So many children still wet their bed well into their teens. Children as young as 3 have displayed inappropriately sexualised behaviour. In addition to children, families are split up. Because of the practice of separating those who came to Australia for medical treatment, as well as the arbitrary nature of that July 19th date, families can remain forever split. So one woman who was brought to Brisbane for treatment recently, she now faces a choice between going back to Nauru or possibly never seeing her children again. Men whose wives have been brought to Australia for a complicated birth are not allowed to accompany them, so they too have never seen their newborns. And of course, families who arrived on 2 or more boats before and after the July 19th date have been separated for over 5 years, with the former now in the Australian community and the latter languishing offshore. Now, these maps show the remoteness of these locations. And I used to say that Nauru was halfway between Australia and Hawaii. In fact, it's very close to halfway. Nauru is in fact a minimum of a 6-hour flight from the nearest port in Australia. Now, there's no medevac or crew station there. So if there's an emergency, it would take a bare minimum of 12 hours to get a flight from Australia to Nauru and back to an appropriate hospital. Now, that's assuming that everything goes to plan, because there are only a few medevacs in Australia and even few pilots able to do the return trip as a single crew. Now, an example of how devastating this is, when the refugee Omid Masamali self-immolated in April 2016, it took 26 hours for a flight from Australia to even reach him. This would never happen in even the most remote of locations in Australia, where the Royal Flying Doctor Service reaches all corners. Now, during this 26-hour period, he was not given morphine for his extensive burns for the first 9 hours. And there's a horrible video of him screaming in the corridor of Nauru Hospital with his skin peeling off. Overnight, emergency staff had difficulties in keeping his airway and his peripheral venous access open, and he eventually died very shortly after arriving in a Brisbane hospital. We know because doctors with Doctors for Refugees were talking to various people in the hospital, and they had a lot of difficulty maintaining an airway. Now, 1 week later, Hodan, completely unrelated, did a similar thing. Only Hodan got a can of petrol, and instead of pouring it from her neck down, she actually poured it from the top of her head before setting herself alight. Hodan was 16 years old, but her birth date was changed by immigration from 1997 to 1994, which made her 19, and therefore able to go to Nauru unaccompanied. There she had been repeatedly sexually assaulted by guards and locals and had tried a suicide a number of times before. Yet, despite having arguably more serious injuries, Hodan survived, as there just happened to be a medevac stationed in Nauru at that time to pick up someone else. So the delays in providing emergency care are not the only result of the remoteness. Between a deliberate policy of making things as unbearable as possible for the refugees so they go back to their country of origin, the prevention of journalists and other visitors to Nauru who can document what they've seen, and the corruption within both of these countries where funds just simply disappear, conditions are horrific and disease spreads easily. In Nauru, there's no fresh foods, no vegetables, no fruits, and no water, as the soil is too contaminated. So all of these items, including the water, are sporadically brought in from Australia, and the food is often rotten and spoiled or simply non-existent. And those two little dots on the side there, they're teeth, human teeth that were found in some of the food. Now this to me is one of the most egregious issues. Medical advice from doctors, the Immigration Department's own contracted doctors, called IHMS, is routinely overridden by non-medical bureaucrats. This absolutely never happens in the Australian community, as any doctor who's ever worked in a remote country town knows. Hamid Karzai was 24 when his foot became infected on Manus Island in late August 2014, the same year that Reza Barati was murdered. IHMS, the Australian-run medical service there, tried a series of antibiotics, but nothing was stemming the infection. So the doctors asked to transfer him off the island, just off Manus and onto Port Moresby on the PNG mainland. Now, just for that, it needed Canberra's approval. And in fact, as the coronial inquest later heard, it needed 5 separate departmental officials to successively approve his transfer. Now, one of them pushed back against the doctors, saying that she preferred to get new medications to the patient rather than transfer the patient. Another went home without checking his emails. Somebody else was busy in a meeting, and so on. There are only 2 commercial flights off Manus Island each day, so each time it's missed, it's another delay. And when Hamid finally arrived in Port Moresby by local air ambulance, none of the equipment worked, and he was in the early stages of brain death from septicemia from the delay. His life support was turned off a week later in Brisbane. But in yet another cruel twist to this tragic tale, there was a perfectly functioning emergency system only metres away, with the proper equipment and well-qualified doctors at the Papua New Guinean hospital, but they were reserved for the Australian Federal Police. So locals of both countries are very often angry about the refugee presence. The Middle East and the Pacific are vastly different regions and cultures, and there's some resentment at times from amongst the locals if the refugees appear to be doing well. The 2 men down the bottom corner were reportedly bashed by drunken PNG police on New Year's Eve. Women are frequently raped on Nauru, often gang raped. One woman was set fire to by her assailants after she was assaulted, and another woman was gang raped while she was having an epileptic seizure. Now, Australia ended its health services on Manus Island in May this year. Health services, which were stretched before, are dangerously inadequate now. This photo actually shows the line for medications before IHMS left. It doesn't depict the searing heat, but the line to get in to get your medications can be hours long. And sometimes people need to take 4 or 5 medications a day. So each time they must line up. They can't get anyone else to stand in for them, and the medications need to be given to them personally. Now, after IHMS first left in October last year, a couple of days later, a man suddenly collapsed during the night with chest pains and difficulty in breathing. Now, we had known him already to have had 2 heart attacks in the past, yet it took 4 hours to get him to East Lorengau Hospital. And when he arrived, there was no ECG machine, nor any facilities to take his blood troponin levels. And these are the local hospitals. On the left is the hospital in Manus Island, and on the right in Nauru. So I'm just going to digress a little and talk about the care that's given at Nauru Hospital. And I'm going to talk about a young boy who many of you have already heard about. This is Irfan, who is an 11-year-old boy, an Iranian boy, who fell off his bicycle in April 2015 and had sustained a double fracture to his forearm. Now, his mother took him to Nauru Hospital, as she was advised to do, and they plastered him up and he sent him on his way. But after 2 weeks of continuing to experience debilitating pain that kept him awake at night, and Nauru Hospital dismissing their concerns, his mother sent the x-rays to her doctor in Iran, who was very concerned and said her son needed urgent surgery on his arm, otherwise he would be permanently deformed. But Nauru Hospital sent her away yet again, and she then contacted our group. Now, from the x-ray, you don't need to be a medical practitioner to realise it's pretty obvious that something is wrong. But as we were quite new to this was middle of 2015, I really wanted to do the right thing and ask the specialists. And in fact, there was 11 different Australian specialists, including orthopaedists, radiologists, paediatricians, emergency room physicians, and so on, who all said, the young boy needs emergency surgery, and the time to get this done had almost passed. Immigration brushed off our letters, but the media got to hear about this, and one evening it appeared on the project. That night, the immigration minister, who had dug his heels in consistently for 2 weeks, announced that he was getting a surgeon to repair the arm. Now, that was probably the first time our group appreciated the value of having a media in changing the narrative, as photos of the young boy and his x-ray started appearing everywhere. That was, being 2015, 3 years ago, the media was pretty starved for any information from Nauru, so we were quite fortunate in that respect. The surgeon, now that you've seen Nauru Hospital, the surgeon quite understandably refused to operate in Nauru. The Immigration Department refused to bring the child to Australia, presumably under the rationale that every mother would then try to break their child's arm. The Immigration Department refused to bring him to Australia. No third country wanted a bar of the whole thing, so they ended up flying an entire operating theatre to Nauru for the surgeon to work in. The cost to fix this arm was reportedly around $500,000. These are some more examples of Nauru Hospital patients. This X-ray showing the plate coming away. You can see that arms aren't supposed to look like that. And the young man below was on a hunger strike to protest against the rotten food. And so they tied him up. Now, that white powder you see over the ground where that little kid is playing is phosphate residue, which covers the whole island from an unregulated phosphate mining in the 1970s. This phosphate contains the highest level of cadmium in the world, something like 100 to 1,000 times the usual levels. And this is a toxin linked to many conditions, including end-stage kidney disease and a variety of cancers. We have several cases of unexplained bleeding in adults, as well as tumours, and at least one case of end-stage metastatic lung cancer, where the government has refused to allow his testing for cadmium. Yet the dangers of cadmium have been previously documented by the government in their official briefings. Also, when it floods on Manus Island, actually at Nauru as well, the area between Delta Compound, where some of the men reside, and the eating area gets filled with raw sewage. Several of the men do not have shoes as they were taken away from them, so the disease clearly flourishes. Now, due to the cramped conditions, infectious diseases are rife, and tuberculosis has emerged. One child had tuberculosis left untested and then untreated for several months. Most children have developed chronic respiratory conditions from the mould, and there's a major infestation of toxic mould in the tents. Now, a couple of years ago, the government tried to have this removed, but the workers who removed the mould from the tents needed to wear protective clothing, goggles and masks and so on to remove it. And the government thought that this would provoke some sort of disquiet amongst the people who'd been living in these tents day in and day out for 5 years. So they actually abandoned removing the mould. Nauru lung is a condition experienced by many former Nauru staffers. Interestingly enough, these tents were hurriedly removed before the world leaders and media arrived for this week's Pacific Island Forum. Human rights organisations, I've put down 3, but if you look it up there, it just goes on for pages and pages. Human rights organisations all over the world have long condemned Australia's treatment, with 103 countries at a recent UN summit using their 58 seconds to call out Australia on this policy. Red Cross, Amnesty International and just 2 others, with Amnesty sending in an undercover worker to Nauru in late 2016 and releasing the report called Island of Despair. Condemnation has also come from home. A few years ago, the Australian of the Year, Dr. Patrick McGorry, used his acceptance speech to describe the offshore detentions as, quote, factories of mental illness. Recent Australian Human Rights Commissioner, Gillian Triggs, has been very vocal in her condemnation, and our near neighbours barely conceal their revulsion. The Trump-Turnbull phone call of January 2017 was widely reported. But even before then, in 2010, there was a proposal to send them to East Timor, made by then Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard. Except she failed to discuss this with East Timor's government before making the very public pre-election announcement. And of course, this was later politely refused by the East Timor's parliament. A few months later, a similar deal was then made with Malaysia, where 400 refugees from Manus and Nauru were to be sent there, with Australia paying $300 million for resettlement, health, education and housing. This was defeated in Australia's High Court due to Malaysia's poor human rights record. Then the newly installed coalition government signed a deal with Cambodia and gave that country $55.5 million in 2014. But to date, only one refugee actually remains there. It's worth noting that none of these proposed deals were sanctioned by the UN, which has condemned them every single time. And yet, meanwhile, our neighbour, New Zealand, has been offering to take them, as New Zealand did with the Tampa standoff in 2001. The astronomical costs should make everyone, medical or otherwise, just condemn this policy on that alone. Various reports are that the offshore centres cost around $9.6 billion. Last month, we've been campaigning for a 2-year-old girl who was comatose with encephalitis to come to Australia. And when they finally relented and brought her here, we actually accidentally saw the invoice, which was $116,000. Now, just last night, the federal government was ordered to pay $100,000 in penalties for cancelling an air ambulance at the last minute that a court had ordered to transfer a very sick woman from Nauru. Now, if all these millions and billions are a little bit too much to process, just compare this figure with it costs $1.2 billion to upgrade a combined Campbelltown, Nepean and Concord hospitals, and a paltry $130 million to build and maintain a new University of Canberra hospital. And lastly, there are many, many studies and reports about the crushing effects of indefinite detention that will exist, that can have lifelong effects. The thing is that these individuals are going to end up somewhere. If not in Australia, then in their country of origin or in the third country. And the trauma that has been inflicted from the years in detention is very often irreversible. Several of these people have still never become functioning members of society, and way too many have suicided upon release. One psychologist described a suicide and the impact of immigration detention on the mental health in these terms, and I quote, "It's like a part of their life was stolen and they will never get it back. By the time this man was released, he was in too many pieces to be put back together again." And this is the greatest cruelty of all. All of the above, every aspect, has been vigorously defended by the argument of saving lives at sea. But the thing is that even putting aside this completely morally bankrupt rationale, it is simply not true. And both sides of politics who keep defending keeping people locked up offshore have actually been forced to admit as much. Operation Sovereign Borders, the military-led flotilla stationed 24/7 in the ocean, has turned back a number of boats, so clearly the deterrence is not working. And in any case, by claiming that the boats will start to arrive in Australia again if they release those trapped offshore, are they suggesting that they do not trust their own navy to intercept an overloaded rickety fishing boat from Indonesia? So our group, Doctors for Refugees, reviews cases we get referred to us by the tireless refugee advocates across Australia. When the Abbott government was elected in late 2013, the very first thing it did was to remove the Independent Health Monitoring Agency for the detention system. So we have sort of taken its place. Now, obviously, this is far from ideal, but as we're not policymakers or human rights lawyers or politicians, and the whole thing can seem quite hopeless, our professional expertise is something that we can use to assist people. And if we don't get any response from the government and the agencies, we go to the media. Now, in 2015, as mentioned earlier, the government announced a brand new law that made anyone, doctors, teachers, security guards, cooks, anyone who spoke about any abuse or neglect in the centres liable to face 2 years in jail. And such a law was unprecedented in the Western world.
Shame. Yeah.
Eventually, in July 2016, after a year of negotiations between the government and the peak medical bodies and the peak legal bodies, our group took them to the High Court. Now, as largely GPs, we'd never done anything like this before, and our representation was a free community legal service, Fitzroy Legal, and yet the government backed down and repealed their legislation. The overriding message from this is that the government, with its massive legal and financial resources, the fact that they could back down to a pretty grassroots bunch of medicos, armed only with a free legal service, speaks volumes as to how paper thin all these ad hoc laws are. They're a paper tiger, they're nothing. And it also demonstrates the power that we all have, well, certainly we have as health professionals, when we stick to our core tenets. Our group was essentially only armed with our medical regulations guide. And in 2016, around 10,000 doctors in 14 cities around Australia marched. This included the State Australian Medical Association presidents, as well as the leaders of various medical colleges. In fact, the College of General Practitioners president spoke at and marched in 2 different states, addressing a crowd of doctors in Tasmania at 10 a.m. He flew up to Sydney and addressed another crowd at 1 p.m. But we're not the only physicians who stand up to the government. When 12-month-old Nepalese girl, baby Asha, was badly burned in Nauru, and she was flown to Australia for treatment. Once she had recovered, the doctors and the hospital refused to discharge her back to Nauru. When immigration threatened to take her anyway, the doctors and staff barricaded the hospital and a vigil of people kept outside, blocking immigration's entry. She's now been in the Australian community for 2 years, which is fabulous news. Exactly. And along with doctors, medical students have been particularly vocal, and rarely do we have a week go by without a medical voice protesting about the conditions in the refugee detention system. I love this post. I got it from 2016, and I think it's something that we all need to keep in mind. You know, we can have a romantic view of injustices in the past, but right now we are facing a catastrophic injustice. And it's not just doctors, because I tell you, when we first started Doctors for Refugees, like I said, we were a little bit concerned because we don't know international law and we don't know how to argue these things from a policy perspective. But we've been able to make a difference. So too have a number of other groups. We have teachers, and we have the founder of Teachers for Refugees over here, Mike Woodcamp, and the terrific students. If you have any musical instruments that you no longer use, a lot of musicians have had musical instruments that they've grown out of. Bill Feinstein has started Music for Refugees and has organised to get these musical instruments taken into the detention centres. I believe he's actually organised them now to go to the offshore centres. I really don't know how. Artists, there was a terrific exhibition late last year, and I think it's been touring this year, of artists who, there was the Nauru files that were released a year or so ago, some 2,000 records from Nauru. Now, these weren't done by activists. These were actual medical records from IHMS. Somehow they got leaked. The artists have drawn pictures of every single one of their records. And that's something that can appeal to artists. You know, I mean, if you're not somebody who wakes up in the morning and puts on ABC 24 and stays in touch with what's happening all the time, there is a way that these individuals can be reached, and sometimes it's through art. And of course, everyone loves the grandmothers against the detention of refugee children. The AMA, somebody at the AMA once described them as a stroke of marketing PR genius, because in a sense they can say anything. You're not going to have Peter Dutton or whoever they've trimmed up now arguing against the grandmothers. So we've just become a charity. There's some of our flyers around there, and all of our work, we don't get any government subsidies, obviously. We don't really expect them if we take them to the High Court. But we also don't get any grants from anyone, and this way we can remain completely independent. But we are a registered charity now, so if anyone's in a position to make any donations, it's all tax deductible. And I'm just going to leave you with this slide, because this slide, this Martin Niemöller quote, which is very familiar to everyone, is absolutely relevant now. Thanks very much.